welcome to the Obsolete Gamer Show, powered by the Obsolete Gamer Network, where gamers and game makers come to talk. I am Jay Laraque, and I'm happy to be joined today by James D'Amato. Hey, James, thanks for coming on with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and hello to all the heroes out there in the audience.
Now, we're here to talk primarily about your book that's coming out on October 2nd, The Ultimate RPG Character Backstory Guide. But one of the things that just caught my eye that I didn't even notice before is that you're from Chicago, which is my hometown. So that's just awesome.
Oh, heck yeah. Well, we got to hang out sometime.
Well, I'm in Miami now, unfortunately, but I was born in Chicago.
Oh yeah, man, I love Chicago. It's a fantastic city, like a great city for the arts, and actually analog gaming too. There are plenty of really great game creators out here. I'm part of an organization out here called CAGWIC. That's the Chicago Area Game Writers Colloquium, where a bunch of game designers meet up at a bar every month and just sort of hang out and talk shop. So Chicago is a wonderful city, beautiful, has fantastic food, and it's really great for games.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I've kind of noticed because growing up in Chicago, one of the times when we really played a lot of game was when it was cold. And anyone knows anything about Chicago, called the Windy City, it gets really cold. And a lot of times, you spend your winters inside. So in the summertime, we were trying to be, going out playing basketball and stuff like that. But man, when winter came, it was like Super Nintendo, PlayStation, things like that. And it's funny because I was seeing that, you studied at Second City. I grew up in Old Town. So I'm right there.
Yeah.
I was like 2 blocks from Wells Street, where Second City is, right near the Walgreens. I used to
you're
go
right
there
around
all
the
the time.
corner. Man.
Yeah. So that's awesome. What was it like? Because I mean, Second City. Anyone who knows anything about people who are coming up in, any entertainment, especially like comedy and things like that, singing, Second City is huge. Can you just tell us what it was like going there?
So Second City is like a really unique experience. Chicago, for those who don't know, is famous for a theatrical art form called improv. Improvisational acting is creating the piece in the moment as you perform it. So rather than working from a written script, you're depending on your scene partners to just say the right things with you to put a story together. And it's a theatrical form that was developed here in Chicago, and we have some of the best schools for improv in the world. Like if you're in a major city, you probably have an improv school near you, but a lot of those programs are based off syllabuses that came out of theaters like the Second City and IO and the Annoyance. So it was something that made me move to the city, actually, because I knew that I wanted to be a comedian, and I tried improv here in Chicago, and I just fell in love with it right from the get-go. So I moved out here, I studied in those theaters, and like it's an intimidating process because everybody who comes out here, like we all, want to do the next big thing in comedy. So there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of work to try and get yourself noticed, and you put a lot of pressure on yourself. But the thing that I really came away with from that experience is like the skills of improvisational acting, which is how I started doing my podcast, which is very much related to improv acting because it's role playing. Tabletop games and role playing are really just a different form of improvisational acting, which is why I think coming up in Chicago and training in those centers really helped me develop something that keyed me up to write this book.
Yeah, and that's what I think sometimes people don't see, because sometimes when you hear improv, usually on television or something, they're always trying to make it sound like it's a joke. Like they'll show somebody just saying one word or the other, and then they usually act like it's boring or something like that. But when you actually go see what these people put into it, the work, I mean, to be able to come up with things, like people always underestimate anything. Like even you see someone on YouTube or something, you're like, oh, that's easy. But you got to stand up there, not only, when you're practicing with your other scene partners, but then when you actually have the audience, and sometimes they ask the audience for input, and you have to be on it. And when you get good at that, I mean, that's amazing. That's a skill that is not easy to come by.
Yeah, it absolutely correct. And it is, I think, a pretty easy thing to joke about. Like we see a show like Whose Line Is It Anyway? Or, you see an improv show that's touring around the country, and like some of it is pretty silly, games in the moment stuff. But there's a lot of really interesting artistic work that happens out here in Chicago. And like most of the comedians that folks know of on programs like SNL come out of an improv school, either here in Chicago or somewhere in LA or in New York. There are schools all over the place, but most of those folks are trained in improv in some way. In fact, two of my buddies who are improvisers in the city just got cast on SNL. So
Nice.
I'm sure folks are going to be seeing that comedy form influencing their comedy that they take in for quite some time.
And just being able to have that, that quick mind also helps with like writing. So I'm sure you being an author, that's helped a lot, and having that kind of imagination, because sure, it's quick timing and you got to be able to pull things, but if you have a good imagination, if you can take something that someone says and not just give maybe the generic answer that almost they're expecting you to say, but you put something really good together, like I was reading, that helps you in like fantasy and like creating characters and things like that, because it just expands your whole mind to be able to come up with like all types of really cool stories for your characters.
Absolutely. And that's one thing that I was really drawing on for the book. The idea of the book, like in short, is a supplementary material that you can use with a role playing game. So most people, when they think of role playing games, will think of, oh my goodness. Most people, when they think of role playing games, will think of something like Dungeons and Dragons, where it's a bunch of people sitting around a table describing a sort of fantasy adventure story. And the book is supposed to help you take characters from something like that and add a little bit more depth to them, make the story more personal, add some more dramatic hooks to that world. So I drew on my experience as an improviser of like, okay, how do I make these decisions really quick in the moment? What tools am I using to develop interesting characters for the stage? And for my podcast, because I play Dungeons and Dragons and similar role-playing games professionally. So how do I make these stories interesting enough that an audience can get invested in them? I really wanted to put those tools down into a format that people could take home and use in their own games, so they can make those dramatic choices as well. And improv is a tremendous cornerstone to that.
And it's interesting because depending on how old you are, it's kind of like how, well, I guess I don't want to stereotype like young to older, but back in the day, especially with older computer games, like you said, tabletop games, they would put a space for you to write in your character's backstory. I remember in City of Heroes,
Yeah.
there was a specific space that you could write some things. And what was awesome about that game is when you right clicked and view the people's like profile, you could read their backstories. And I always found it interesting between the contrast between sometimes you would see someone who maybe were, because City of Heroes was known of people trying to create Marvel characters or DC characters.
Mhm.
Most of the time, if they created one of those, it would either be blank or it'd be like one line. But then someone who created their own unique character, you would see like maybe like two paragraphs where this person put together a story, and sometimes they interweaved it with the lore of the game. And I mean, that's awesome, especially in computer games, especially now when you have console games where a lot of people now just want to play whatever the character put together, especially with voice acting and things like that. A lot of people don't want to create their own character because they want everything to already be put together for them. But I think it's almost a lost art, and to see that people are still interested in creating character backstories is great.
It's certainly one of those things that's unique about pen and paper role playing. And like a lot of the concepts that we have in video games and a lot of electronic gaming formats come out of those pen and paper tabletop games. Like when you think of like very simple concepts in gaming, like hit points and leveling up, that was developed on tabletops through pen and paper. So a lot of those role playing games that you see, like even MMOs, like I think even the very earliest ones, like EverQuest, would have slots for you to describe your character backstory or describe your character's appearance, even though they're giving you the avatar to use in the game world. You were able to fill that out with written story because folks who were creating those games were taking a cue from pen and paper tabletop games. So it's really fascinating now to see a world where people's first brush with these concepts actually comes from the electronic versions. And we're circling back around to where D&D and role-playing games in general are kind of having this cultural resurgence, like appearing on shows like Stranger Things and Critical Role taking off and being the huge cultural phenomenon that it is. Like we're seeing people re-encounter the kind of creative freedom that you have with a tabletop game versus an electronic game. Like if you're playing a video game, you can only really do actions that the programmers anticipate. Like if you want to climb a wall, the programmer has to design that wall to be climbed. If you're playing a pen and paper tabletop game, you just say that you do that and you do it. Um, it's really cool to see folks like who have been fed all of these really amazing stories from really cool game franchises and then take those ideas to a tabletop space where they can literally do anything and see what they create.
And that's a great thing when you have a group together that is really good, especially if you have a good dungeon master or lore master, who's ever is running that game. You can really put together, because I've played games where it was like a sci-fi game. I forget the name, but when we got there, you could tell the quest was like we were supposed to get captured and then we were supposed to like fight our way out. But
Uh-huh.
then I was like, you know what? What happens if I just decide to switch and turn on my other teammates? And the dungeon master was ready. It's like, okay, well then this happens and this happened. And it's funny because it almost created two games, because I ended up going over on this side for a while, and then the other people continued with what was kind of planned out. And that really expanded the game, because at first people were like, what are you doing? You're messing up the game. But then they slowly realized that's like, oh wow, this is actually fun. And sometimes maybe people don't get that. Even as big as gaming has got, you still may have that rift between someone that's like, oh, well, what does this even matter? What do you care about backstories? Can you just explain to people, like, for people like us who really do like to create backstories for characters, what that means to us? What does that do for the character in the games that we're playing?
So I think any detail that you add to a game world adds stakes to it. We can actually abstract this to like a video game concept. Way back on the NES and like Atari consoles, they would release a game and they would release it with the instruction manual where you would get the story of that game from the instruction manual. Like if we break down Mega Man to its base component parts, you're like jumping over some obstacles and shooting other obstacles. That's like all that's in the core of the game. But the story, Dr. Light creating Mega Man to go fight Dr. Wily, who's taken over the world, that's all existing in a different space. And I think the thing that people take away from Mega Man, like, yes, we all like timing our jumps, we all like shooting enemies, we all like the challenge of navigating those levels. But the thing that sticks with people is the story of that game that was really just laid out on a page. So when you take that concept to tabletop gaming, when you bring in your human fighter character, it makes a big difference if you have a human fighter character who is battling goblins so that they can find the last known location of their long lost brother, than it is for them to just be a human fighter who fights goblins because goblins are there to be fought. So creating a character backstory changes a story by adding stakes to it, by giving it greater importance to you because you've invested more creative energy in it and you have a deeper emotional connection to the character and story.
So overall, in the book, would you say that it's more for people who maybe aren't used to creating backstories and doing things like that with RPGs? Or is it for beginners as well as advanced people who've been writing backstories for years?
So I would say that yes, this runs a gambit from being accessible to beginners and still providing useful tools to folks who have been playing for years and years. The book itself is 100 different exercises and mini games that range from like actual dice-driven games that you can play alone with yourself or at a table, or writing prompts that you can do in between game sessions to fill in character backstory by asking you as a player directed questions about your character and the game world. So if you're somebody who has been playing for years and years and years, rather than building characters whatever standard way you do, you can do some of the exercises in this book and maybe approach the idea of building a character, building out a character story in a way that you had never thought of before. Or take a character that you already have and recontextualize them through some of the questions and exercises in the book. And if you're totally new, like if you've never built a character before, if you've never played a role playing game before, exercises in this book can sort of help stoke your creativity and help drive you to understand how this process works, and maybe even just dip your toe in the water of role playing if you've never gone out and played a role playing game like D&D or Shadowrun or Pathfinder, what have you. You can take this book and it has those imagination games, those exercises in creativity written into it, so you can see if, like, oh yeah, this is totally my jam, I would do this. Or maybe it's probably not worth investing the effort of learning a new game system and finding a group to try it out because this isn't doing it for me.
And it's interesting because for anyone who's taken like creative writing or classes like that, they have little exercises too that kind of help you with like writer's block or just coming up with that first beginning story. And even if you already kind of have a story, like fleshing out the characters and things like that. So it's really interesting that you can apply the techniques that people would do to creating characters for written works to the same that you would apply to a tabletop game or even a video game for your backstory.
Absolutely. One of the things that I was thinking about when putting this book together is choice paralysis. It's something that hits people a lot. When in a tabletop game, I meant what I said when you can do literally anything. There's no limits on your creativity. It's really a collaboration between you, the other players at the table, and your game master as to what's possible in those game worlds. Uh, that can be an intimidating prospect for some people, even if it doesn't strike you as an intimidating prospect at first. If I say to you, a random person on the street, hey, make a character right now, you have so many options to do that, that it's overwhelming, and maybe you're not coming up with the best stuff, which is why the book sort of channels you in different directions and directs that creativity so that you can focus on it more and get better results.
Now, obviously, people should be going out and get this book, even if you are like you said, new to the idea of RPGs, tabletop, or just creating character backstories. But would you say that there's maybe some building blocks for people, like if they just said, "Hey, what are some things you think are like maybe general that I could put into when I'm creating a character?" Because a lot of times when I look at it, I think to myself, okay, if I'm going to play a priest, what kind of priest am I going to be? And especially if it's something where I'm typing with people and I'm actually role playing in the game, I'll make the backstory match. So then when I'm doing those actions and typing and deciding what to do, it matches the backstory. Would you say that when someone's building their character's backstory, there's a couple of like key things they want to consider?
Yes, absolutely. I have a couple different sections that sort of help you chart out through and sort through different tropes as you're working. Like religion itself, which I'm trying to even find the specific exercise of how to chart your religion. It sort of breaks down the concepts of being a religious character in, like, are you more invested in the structure of your religion, or are you more invested in the message of your religion? So are you an evangelical character who really wants to spread the religion itself? Or are you more of a sage character who wants to talk to people, doesn't care if they practice your religion, but do care that they take home the messages that that religion sends? Um, and that sort of helps you lay out your character details on sort of like a charted grid. So you can see, okay, my character rests here. They really do want to spread this religion as much as possible, but they also really care about the core message of the religion. So they're willing to be flexible in some areas like that. So yeah, it's not just exercises that are like straight writing prompts for you. Some of them are exercises that just help you think differently about things you might have already created for the character. Like one of the sections of the book is called "Wed, Bed, or Behead," which is just you playing, screw, marry, kill, with different NPC concepts in the world and being like, okay, if this is your character answering this question, how would they answer it? It might be different than how you as a player answer it, or the other players and characters at the table answer it, which I think is an interesting, different kind of framing device that people can use to build character.
Yeah, and I think that it's like anything else. People talk about how they love a character in a TV show like Game of Thrones. They'll say, "Oh, I identify with this character. I identify with this one." And in video games, there's always like character or storyline that you get used to, especially the newer video games where they almost take like a movie concept with a lot of cutscenes and things like that.
Mhm.
And by creating your own character backstory, you're giving yourself that because I know that for a time back in the day when tabletop was still kind of like underground, people are like, well, how could that be fun? You're sitting there and you're moving around a little plastic or metal piece. And now you see people going to cafes. It's like you said, a huge resurgence because people are taking that same imagination, that same love that they have for characters on television and movies and applying it to pen and paper. And it's bringing that imagination back.
Yeah, it's tremendously powerful, the way tabletop role-playing games work. I mean, most forms of entertainment, whether it's a movie, or a television show or a book, the entertainment is like coming at you, right? It's a one-way channel where you are taking in those stories and you are watching along. And you think about those shows and maybe wonder things about those characters and imagine things on your own, but at the end of the day, it's really the media is coming to you to be observed. With a tabletop role playing game, you are in the director's seat. You are there writing the character as the game is being played. So it's the kind of show where exactly what you want to happen happens because you get to make it happen. Um, and a lot of people think like, well, yeah, that's like a silly imagination game that I played as a kid. The rule structures and the way the game is shaped sort of help ease off of that, or take it away from a space where there are no rules. Like they create a couple simple structures that allow you to do whatever you want, still within the confines of doing something that has its own internal logic. And I was trying to use that same sort of system to create games and rules for people to use when they're just away from the table thinking of backstories with the book.
So, what are the games that you grew up with and that you really enjoy playing?
Okay, so I think one of the most fundamental like role playing games to who I am as a creator is a game that actually recently got published in a new edition called Feng Shui. And Feng Shui is an action movie role playing game. It was made sort of based on things like Die Hard and Big Trouble in Little China and like old school Jackie Chan movies like Operation Condor and Armor of the God. Uh, it's just like an action movie game, and it has a lot of neat rules in it. Like there's a character called like the Everyman Hero who's not super good at kung fu or anything. They're sort of like your average Joe from the street. Jack from Big Trouble in Little China would be a good example of this character. And one of the rules in that game for this character is this character gets a +1 when they use an improvised weapon. So something that's not meant to be a weapon as a weapon. But they only get it the first time they use that weapon. Meaning, if you're in a fight, you've got to be thinking of like, okay, I'm going to use this spatula to hit this guy, and then I'm going to pick up this pepper shaker and throw pepper in this other guy's face and whatnot. So it sort of challenges you to be creative in a fictional environment like that. And in D&D, a lot of the time it's like, well, you have a sword and you're rolling a die to use your sword. In Feng Shui, it was about using sort of the rules of fiction to build a clever story that you maybe have seen elements of before, but like you really get to control this time. So the idea of making your own action movie and the fact that the game was like really setting you up to make interesting creative choices fascinated me, and I love that. And I'd say the game that I like most today, my favorite role playing game right now, is a game called Starcrossed, which is so tremendously different than something that you would see in Dungeons and Dragons or even something like Feng Shui. Starcrossed is a two-player romance game where you play two characters who really, really want to be together, but have a good reason keeping them apart, sort of like a Romeo and Juliet scenario. And instead of using dice or cards or anything else to determine what happens in the game, there's a Jenga tower in the middle of the table. And every time you do something that involves the other character that like increases their relationship, increases their romantic intimacy, you draw a brick from the tower and place it on top like it's Jenga. And if the tower falls over while you're playing, your character has acted on their feelings. The things that they were trying to hide, the things that they were trying to deny themselves, like come out in a moment of passion. And if it happens too soon, then that relationship probably isn't meant to be. You know, it was the wrong time, or the characters really didn't get together, or the world just wouldn't accept them. But if you build up the tower, if like you take all of these risks bringing these characters closer together, they might decide to run away together. It's a fascinating game that is like a tremendous like achievement in game design. It puts you in these characters' heads, and the design of the game really compels you to feel what that character is feeling in those moments, and the rules are designed around that. I think it's probably the best role playing game that I've ever played. It's available for pre-order right now from the publisher, and it'll be out very soon. But it's like one of the games that I was definitely thinking of when I was writing this book, because the way its rule structure is designed is just so focused on driving player creativity. The way the characters are set up together really bring you emotionally close to those characters, and it makes the stories that you tell in that game so much more powerful, which is essentially what I want to do with this book is help people get closer to their characters so that they can experience those powerful stories.
Wow, both of those sound good. I gotta check those out. That sounds really
Oh yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, but both of them are classics. I recommend them 100%.
So tell us a little bit about your podcast, because there's a lot of people who's always asking, like, what is it really like putting something together? Like, how do you come up with a good idea? How do you draw an audience? How do you, engage people? Can you just tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Of course. So my podcast is called the OneShot Podcast, part of the OneShot Podcast Network. And on OneShot, we play different role playing games. Every week, we have a new hour-long episode that is part of probably the episodes usually come in like 2 to 3 part series of us playing a role-playing game. We just finished up. Actually, can we swear on this show?
Oh, of course. Yep.
Yeah, we just finished up playing a role-playing game called "Fuck It's Dracula," which is a really neat little system where you play characters who are on an alien planet thousands of years in the future, and Dracula lands on that planet, and you sort of have to deal with Dracula. Um, so we play through different role playing games with a rotating cast of improvisers, comedians, game designers, and other sort of like notable nerds from around the like industry, and we show you what those games are like. So if you're curious of what is it like to play a role playing game, you can sort of listen along to our podcast and get an idea of it. We try to show off as many systems as possible, and we try to really feature ones that we think are super unique and have an interesting voice in like the larger design conversation. And the shows I think are pretty entertaining, pretty funny. Like we usually play with comedians, folks who are professional performers, and the stories kind of reflect that. If you're like, we're excited about our feng shui, the feng shui game that I just described. Like we did a whole action movie series based on feng shui, starring they were fictional Jackie Chan movies that never existed. The last one was a Jackie Chan movie where Jackie Chan and Shaq co-starred in a film together, where they had to play basketball to save the world. It was ridiculous. And if you liked Star-Crossed, we featured Star-Crossed not too long ago on our show too. So I've been doing that for the past 5 years, and it's been a tremendously creatively like fulfilling thing to do, because I get to tell about every month I get to sink myself into a new setting and tell a new story with people.
And where can people find your podcast?
They can just go to oneshotpodcast.com. You'll be able to find One Shot there, along with all of our other shows like Campaign, which is based around like longer form games. So instead of jumping to system, we sort of spend a couple years playing just one game with a one cast of characters and see how that pans out. And we've got plenty of interview and discussion shows. So if you're like bitten by the RPG bug and you really want to learn more about it, you can listen to shows like Backstory and Modifier to learn more about gaming.
That's awesome. So the book is the Ultimate RPG Character Backstory Guide. It's coming out October 2nd. Where can people find that book?
So that is actually going to be wherever books are sold. It's published by Adams Media, which is an imprint of Simon and Schuster, which means they're distributing wherever you want them to go. If you've got a favorite indie brick and mortar bookstore that you like to go to, they'll be able to order it. But it's also available through Barnes and Noble and Amazon and pretty much anywhere.
That is awesome. Well, I want to say thank you for coming on and telling us about not only the book, but also about your podcast. I'm going to check out the podcast because that idea, that concept sounds awesome. But I really want to say thanks for coming on with us. And also, I'd love to have you come back sometime when you have some free time just to talk a little bit more about the different games and tabletop games that you guys play.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love that. Feel free to hit me up anytime. This was a delight.
Thanks.